Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Click to Buy, the show where we ask eCom experts like you for their best advice to help you turn clicks into customers. I'm your host, Becca from Instant Page Builder, and today's guest is Michael Dong, the co-founder of OneSend, a Facebook Messenger marketing tool that's transforming how brands engage with their customers. But before starting OneSend, Michael worked at an e-com marketplace and then at Meta. But now with OneSend, Michael is bridging the gap between email marketing and Facebook Messenger, enabling businesses like yours to leverage a platform where they can achieve impressive results. Think 75% open rates within 24 hours or click-through rates that are 500% higher than traditional email. With stats like those, that's why I am so excited to chat with Michael today so you can learn how ecom brands can use Messenger as a channel to scale your growth. Well, after that introduction, the only thing I have left to say is, Michael, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you.
Oh my God, thank you, Becca. Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much for having me and also giving me the chance to talk a bit more about myself and OneSend. Let's get started.
Absolutely. I mean, I know I was really excited to have you on the podcast, and we'll dive into this question later, but I know a lot of people that I've chatted with in e-com are like, Messenger, are people still using Messenger? But clearly with some of the stats you presented with me with before recording, like there might be some advantages to using this channel, so I can't wait to dive in. Well, before we like really dive into like the nitty-gritty, I would love to just like hear a little bit about your background. Could you
Definitely.
maybe share more about like your journey from working at an e-com marketplace to joining Meta to co-founding OneSend? Like, what did that look like, and what motivated you to start focusing on messenger marketing?
Great question, great question. And I also, great way for me to also introduce a bit about myself so people know who I am.
Yeah.
So originally, I was in New York City. I was
Hmm.
working at an e-commerce marketplace called First Dibs. And the way First Dibs, its niche was to work on luxury and antique goods. And one of the things, this was back in, I want to say 2017. So this is before drop shipping was a well-known term. Back then,
Hmm.
we were starting to face a lot of competition because of Chinese dropshippers in Asia. And that became one of like, on my team, we started doing a lot of research in terms of what's happening over there, what's kind of the trends that we could look forward to in the US. And I think
Hmm.
this is what initially sparked my own curiosity, if you could put it that way, to move to Asia. So around that time was when Meta had extended an offer for me to move to the Singapore office. And they said, hey, and this became kind of, for me, it was a big leap. Just for context, my whole family's in the US. I've never lived in Singapore. Didn't know anyone, but I decided to take this leap in 2019. I moved over to Meta to look after one of their biggest markets, which is the Greater China region. And in
Hmm.
the most recent earnings reports, they've started publicly releasing that China is the second biggest market for Meta in terms of advertising. So this is kind of just a scale that I was looking at in terms of numbers. And there was two things that made it really interesting around this time. Because if you remember during COVID, one of the biggest headwinds in e-commerce was iOS 14.5.
Hmm.
When you think about how Meta makes money mostly through advertising, a lot of their advertisers are e-commerce companies. That's where a huge chunk of their revenue came from. And when iOS 14.5 came about, the targeting started getting really, really bad. There's obviously been patchworks like CAPI, server-side tracking, but in general, ad targeting has deteriorated a bit. Around the
Hmm.
same time was when Facebook, when it was called back then, said, "Hey, we need to diversify our revenue a little bit. We focus a lot on ads, but let's see what other platforms we can go through." So there was a heavy investment in this concept called business messaging, and when it came to business messaging, Asia was always at the forefront. If you've gone to Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, a lot of the Southeast Asia countries, you start to see that a lot of these businesses didn't really work with email. They worked purely on
Hmm.
like WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, DM, and that's became kind of these factors that started fueling, hey, what could we do with messaging? Well, how can we bring this to e-commerce businesses that are one having issues with ad targeting because ROI has gone down, CPMs have gone up, but two, also this new trend that's been growing a lot in Asia, and we're starting to see a bit more of it too in rest of the world. And so that's where OneSend came to be.
Wow, what a story. I love that you took such a big leap to change countries for this opportunity, that it seems like you had thought about quite a lot about like what the future potential was, and it sounds like you're still taking these opportunities of looking at like what's happening here and how might we be able to use this information to kind of get ahead of the curve in like the US or other countries.
That's a great way to put it. I think in certain regards, obviously different countries have different cultures, but there are
Hmm.
some trends that we're seeing here in Asia that we're starting to see being replicated in other countries like the US. US is still, for concept like Meta, US is still the number one country. But we're even in the earnings reports, Meta's
Hmm.
quarterly earnings reports, they will always highlight now how much WhatsApp has been growing in the US, how much business messaging has been growing over as part of their total revenue side. And at least maybe I'm very biased on this, is that
Yeah.
we're starting to believe that this is something that started off here, but it's already starting to grow quite a bit by leaps and bounds in other countries.
Absolutely. So you're really saying that kind of like the earnings reports kind of show how that growth that you've seen in like Southeast Asia might be happening also in the US.
Correct. It's I guess it's the adoption and the behavioral changes that we're starting to see.
Very interesting. And definitely, if you're listening in and you're thinking, like, what channel should I be using? Like, we actually, one of our probably 2 episodes ago, we had someone on who was promoting handwritten communication and bringing that back.
There
And
you
for
go. Yeah.
obviously a very different channel, but with the same reasoning that, people's email inboxes are getting really cluttered. So you have to try to diversify and try different channels. Well, I would love to dive into, of course, like, how messenger marketing can kind of fit into this marketing mix. I know
Yeah.
you've mentioned to me that you've seen like remarkable metrics with messenger marketing, like 75% open rates, 8% click-through rates. What do you think is driving such high engagement compared to, let's say, like email marketing?
That's a really really good question. I think I'll be honest. When we first entered the space, one of my biggest concerns was that hey, this won't work, right? I think
Yeah.
you mentioned it in the intro almost earlier too. It's like, oh, do people even use Messenger? And this is when my co-founder and I decided, like, hey, let's focus on Messenger first. We're like, is this gonna work? That was,
Hmm.
I guess, when you think about risks when you start a startup. This is our biggest one. Like, does this actually work? What we noticed is, and this risk, this concern went away really really fast. Once we got our
Nice.
first few users, they started getting their subscribers, and they were like, oh wow, the open rates are really high, right? And they're like,
Yeah.
oh, the people are actually like opening it really fast because normally I'm not. Maybe my behavior is a bit different than yours. When I get an
Hmm.
email in the morning, doesn't mean I'll open it in the morning. Maybe when I have time, or if I'm on a
Hmm.
in a queue at a coffee shop, I'll open it up. But what we started noticing is that hey, you send a message and the open rates within like the next 10 minutes could be as high as 40-50% just because people receive the notification and they open it up. So to
Hmm.
circle to your question, what do I think is driving this? The biggest reason, at least we think right now, and the one biggest advantage is the first mover advantage.
Hmm.
Right now, email, you also mentioned it earlier, is quite crowded. People don't open up emails or click through it as much, but right now in your messenger inbox, it's still mostly friends, it's personal relationships. And so when you see a notification on that, you're a lot more apt to open it up. You're a lot more curious and a lot more interested to see it. And so on one end, that's been driving a lot more conversions, both through the open rates, the click-through rates, and even the revenue side is what we started seeing also recently. But on the
Hmm.
other end, it's also created a more personal and direct relationship. And I know I'm kind of speaking a little bit. I'm adding on to this question a bit.
No, I love it. Let's keep going.
One of the biggest things that we've noticed is the idea of using instead of click-through messages, like reply
Huh?
messages in the sense
Hmm.
where it's like, hey, this isn't like a promotion to our Black Friday sale. Like those happen, those are still our bread and butter. That's what majority of our customers use. Is like, hey, we have the sale coming up. Here's the early access. Here's a discount code to go through. But what we're starting to see, and it's been like, this is a bit more manual because you have to reply back. It's like, hey, the first 50 people that reply back to this get this special discount code, or you get this special
Mm.
price. So there is no CTA button. It encourages an actual conversation, which for them, and depending on the size of your business, obviously, it's actually been very, very effective.
Interesting. I feel like that's kind of like stealing the playbook, not necessarily the same as you would have seen with like traditional like SMS marketing, but
Yeah.
something that like some of those strategies now you're trying to twist and use in Messenger. It sounds like it could be quite interesting. I know I was trying to think, of course, before chatting with you, have I ever used Messenger or like WhatsApp to chat with a brand? And I can think of it maybe twice, and I think
Yeah.
both were with like airlines, but both times it was like a lot faster than me like on the phone or trying to do like some of those chats or discounts through email. So I can see how like there could definitely be that potential there. And as you've mentioned, it sounds like there's lots of ways to make it exciting.
Absolutely. That's also a great analogy is that I'll be honest, this is still a very new tool, a
Hmm.
very new channel, and we've been experimenting a lot with different playbooks. And the closest
Hmm.
ones we could leverage is obviously email and SMS. What's worked for those channels,
Yeah.
and we can bring it on. You've been spot on. This is something one of our customers did for SMS, and then we
Hmm.
were saying, hey, let's see if this will work on Messenger. Messenger has a few different, I guess, unique capabilities. One is that
Yeah.
hey, you actually have the whole message thread so in case you change your
Hmm.
phone number, like, oh, this is actually the Facebook page I've been talking to. So we've been experimenting around with it.
Exciting, exciting. I can't wait to hear more. Maybe we'll have to do a check-in in 6 to 8 months or so to hear like which tactics have evolved, since I think
Definitely.
sounds like we're on the early edge if you're listening in. I would love to hear like a little bit more about how brands can integrate Messenger into their existing marketing strategies without overwhelming their customers.
That's a good question. I think that it's like one of the first things like when we first started this off, we started talking with a lot of e-commerce merchants of all different sizes, and
Hmm.
this is probably part of the whole customer validation, seeing if this is actually a need. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback we got from the merchants was saying like, hey, we want this to be super easy to use, right?
Hmm.
We want this so that we don't have to learn a whole new tool. Like so, when we designed it, we built it so it's super simple and lightweight. If you do take a look at it, it's pretty much like, hey, this is how you build a campaign, you send it out. So
Hmm.
that's on the merchant side. I think on your question, the customers, I wish there was a better answer besides it depends. I think a lot of things tend to depend on like your
Yeah.
customers and the group. What we've noticed is if you're a merchant that already has a lot of customers using, say, Facebook groups, that
Hmm.
they're already quite active in those communities, it tends to work very well in terms of transition. Uh, one of our one of our early customers, they had a Facebook group and they were selling sewing patterns, right? So it's patterns,
Hmm.
it's not like it's a digital product. And when they transitioned over from Facebook group to Messenger, it was a very easy and smooth concept because now they could speak directly with the brand as opposed to a Facebook group, which is still very active. There was just
Hmm.
different types of conversations.
Interesting, especially that you're kind of like still, which I think is really smart, pulling those lessons from other channels to make it a little bit less confusing for like a marketer who's learning, yeah, another channel that they want to leverage without making it like too stressful. Because I know marketers like myself, we're like in charge of all the channels. So as easy as you can make it somewhere we're already familiar with, like that's key.
You're so right. It's also not just a lot of channels, but also just a lot of
Hmm.
things to keep track of, right? Like I think
True,
every time I
yeah.
talk to someone who's really in the industry, there's a checklist, and there's just always so many things we need to get done. And so for us, like I think this is also one of our biggest learnings when
Hmm.
we got through is like we wanted to make this very easy to use, very automated,
Hmm.
where it's super simple, and that's where we've been starting to see a lot more appeal of it too.
Interesting. Well, I definitely will have to play around with the tool after the podcast, but interesting to hear already like how brands are working with it. And I love that how honest you are with your it depends answer because we love to hear that. We know some things are a fit for some brands, some things aren't, some things really work with certain customer groups, some things don't. So you always just have to try.
I think that's it's I think that's also been one of the biggest lessons for us because we worked with a lot of different merchants, different sizes, different industries, and some of
Hmm.
them like as much as I hate to say it's like okay this probably isn't the best channel for you, but there's other ones that it does gangbusters on, and I think one thing that we've started
Hmm.
to notice at least as we've also iterated is to see which ones and start to see the commonalities between what works for
Okay.
which brands, what doesn't, and then seeing like hey how can we better serve the ones it does work for.
Absolutely. I would love to touch on something we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, which is like what common misconceptions do you encounter about messenger marketing and how are you addressing them when you're chatting with e-commerce brands?
Absolutely. I think there's two misconceptions that I tend to talk a lot about, and they're not
Hmm.
misconception. I think it's more just education in
Hmm.
terms of like this is very new, so most people aren't as familiar. The first part is the idea that people don't use Facebook much. This
Hmm.
is one. I think it depends a lot specifically on which country or like where the merchant is selling to. Facebook has been around for a while. Like I think I started on it when I think I was like what 14, 13, 14 years old. It's obviously
Yeah.
evolved into a much different platform since then. And I'll be the first to also say, like, hey, sometimes the feed stuff isn't exactly the most relevant. But there's
Hmm.
also a bit of a difference between Facebook as a app versus Messenger, right? In terms
Hmm.
of conversations, this is where our one cent leverages is that, hey, it's the conversations aspect. And when you look at and again, I know I refer to the earnings reports a lot, but in terms of
Yeah.
numbers, those are the ones that have been publicly released, so I'm going to rely a bit on those.
Yeah.
Is that when it comes to the usage, Facebook Messenger is still one of the most heavily used apps in the Meta Business Suite. That's why there's been a lot more focus towards conversations. I think if you and I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. Is that all right, Becca?
That's
Just
all right. Let's hear the rant.
all right. I think this is where we kind of see how social media has also evolved a bit. When we first started off, was the idea that hey, all your friends were your actual personal in-person friends. You posted photos and texts or updates, and it was your friends who saw it.
Hmm.
What Meta has noticed, and also what how they've evolved, is that hey, these are the public forums. These are now where influencers or key opinion leaders now post. Where the more intimate settings, where it's more the what they call the living room space, that's what happens in
Hmm.
group chats now. That's what happens in messaging. So, for instance, if when I was in Vietnam this past weekend for vacation, and I went to try different foods, took different photos, I didn't post it on Facebook publicly. I posted it in group chats or specifically sent it to friends, and that's
Hmm.
where messaging has conversations has still become a very powerful tool. One that's mainly like person to person. It hasn't much been business to person yet, and that's where we're also thinking there's a bit of opportunity.
Interesting. I'm really curious with that, like, if you've seen any success with, like, do you think it's brands that have really humanized themselves that are going to do well when they're trying to enter that more personal space? Or how do you think they should approach, like, the way that they're going to enter that what seems like a more intimate space now, but in a way that's like engaging and welcome?
Yeah, I think this also definitely speaks to your experience, Becca, in terms of your
Yeah.
own experience in marketing. Is part of it, like if we take it from a top level down, part of branding
Hmm.
is how do you set yourself apart from other businesses, right?
Hmm.
What at least my hypothesis is that for brands to stay competitive, especially new ones or ones in very crowded industries, how do you differentiate yourself to your consumers versus say another supplements brand if you sell supplements or
Hmm.
another female apparel store, because those also pop up. There's a lot of competition. What we've seen, at least within the retention space, is also just the idea of personalization, right? How do you personalize messages, offers to that person? And if you take personalization to another level, that is becoming this more human, more interactive experience and more intimate type of like, hey, I'm talking not just a brand, but to like of someone that I'd actually like, I want a recommendation in terms of, hey, what shirt would look good on me, or like, what are you seeing? That type of more consultative feeling.
Interesting. And that does make a lot of sense. I think so many guests on this podcast mention personalization in like whatever niche they're specifically specializing in. And it makes a lot of sense that with communication and messaging, also you want messages that are relevant and are coming at the right time from the right voice or brand.
100%. And sorry, I did for this question you mentioned that there was misconception. There was a second one
Yes.
that I know we have
Oh,
to
go
but
for it.
okay.
We
The
have time.
other the other misconception that I do get asked a lot is OneSend a chatbot? And I want to
Hmm.
say like chatbot, like the way I differentiate chatbots and what OneSend does. Chatbot is what I consider customer initiated conversations.
Okay.
OneSend does business initiated conversations, and I know that it's like if you start delineating the two by that, chatbots tend to work if you mentioned airlines. Let's say you wanted to change your
Hmm.
flight ticket, you would initiate the conversation, but then the opposite doesn't happen, right? The airline doesn't message you and say like, hey, we actually have a promotion this weekend, or we're like,
Hmm.
hey, we have a special business class promotion. You have to do X amount of mileage points. That doesn't happen with chatbots. It's a decision tree. It's like, hey, if person asks FAQs, go through this. It's made mostly for customer service, which is great because it also could relieve human agent time. What OneSim does, because it's a business initiated conversation, it does say like, hey, we have a Black Friday sale coming up. Oh, we have early access VIP sale exclusive for you. So it allows the brand to take more control over how the conversation goes instead of just waiting for the customer to come and message about that.
Okay. Interesting, and especially the way you place that, it makes a lot of sense using like the airline analogy. Indeed, the only time I've ever got a message from an airline is when it's like bad news, like your flight is canceled
Oh yeah,
or this is overbooked, where instead this would be something maybe a little bit more welcoming, like special promotion just for you, or
exactly.
those jeans that you wanted that were out of stock, they're back and we have them here, something that I actually might want to read.
Definitely.
Interesting. Well, thank you for diving into both of those misconceptions. I think it's both are very like interesting points. Like, A, people are still using Messenger. So if you're listening to this and you think that people aren't on Messenger, we've got the stats to prove some people are clearly still active there. It shows in the earnings report. And number two, OneSend isn't a chatbot, but it's interesting to think about like the different use cases for a business and their marketing funnel. Of course, customer success is very important with like the chatbot, as you mentioned, can
Definitely.
help with helping with support agents and whatnot, but instead welcoming, maybe starting a conversation that might lead to a new customer or returning customer, maybe making another purchase or joining your loyalty program, or who knows, I guess what goal
Yeah,
could be.
absolutely.
Well, I'd love to hop on to another question. I would, now that we've kind of discussed how OneSend works a little bit, I'm curious, like in your experience so far, what sort of content have you seen performs really well in Messenger? Like, are there certain campaigns or formats you've found particularly effective? I know you mentioned like kind of the SMS style before. Is there anything else you've seen?
Yeah, so I think one like well, I'll use SMS as kind of the differentiation because I think it's a closer
Mm-hmm.
example. So between Messenger and SMS, there's a few differences. One of the biggest differences for at least Messenger is your file type that you can send. So
Okay.
normally, when you send a message, you can send images, you can send videos, you can send text, you can include buttons and galleries. I think in terms of that, that's where we differentiate a bit more from SMS. Is that the
Mm-hmm.
video uploads have actually been very effective. I think there's been times, and I also take a step back, is that we also have a variety
Mm-hmm.
of customers of different maturity in terms of marketing sophistication. And some of them will send literally a reel, they'll download the reel that they sent, and then
Mm-hmm.
or they upload it, send it, and send that out as their message with a button to it. And say like, hey, here's how the product is used. You can either click to the reel itself, or you can just go through and go to our website and purchase it. That has been quite effective in the sense where it's a bit more eye-catchy. It's a video
Yeah.
platform. It plays pretty quickly on Messenger versus say what it if it even it does play on SMS depending on the platform you use. So that's been one that we're starting to experiment a bit more with, seeing how the results work versus static images and videos. The other one that we've already kind of talked about is kind of creating this more personal, deeper relationship. This one
Mm-hmm.
it's a bit operationally taxing, right? Because you need someone on the other end to respond back. Because imagine if somebody messages you and you never respond, like you don't get a response for over
Yeah.
24 hours. That one it's been a bit harder to try out and experiment with, but it's been quite effective.
All right. Interesting. I love that. It's very interesting that like even just sending like a reel works pretty well so far that you've seen. But I
Yeah,
guess it makes sense. Like it's already something that's optimized for mobile. People probably scrolling on their phone when they're opening Messenger and then it just
yeah.
pops up, fills the screen perfectly. I can see it. I can see it. Well, of course, you have spotted maybe this trend before other people, but as an expert in maybe spotting what the future could be in the areas of business messaging, I would love to know your future prediction. Like, what trend should ecom brands be watching out for business messaging, and how can they prepare to leverage these trends for future
Uh,
growth?
okay. Time to enter the prediction market on this one, Becca.
Yes.
I think I think when it comes to business messaging, there's a lot of opportunity for it because it is
Hmm.
one that, like, when you think about how often we use desktops, it's gone like a lot of communication has become mobile first.
Hmm.
A lot of communication, a lot of apps, a lot of the tools we use has become mobile first, and this is where where I start to wonder, like, hey, imagine in the future generations, and I'm thinking years now, like decades later, how commonplace stuff like desktops, computers, or like because we're talking to each other on computers
Hmm.
when that happens, like how much will people use email, right? The classic question I always say is like, when was the last time you sent a personal email? And
Good question. I think unless you have something personal in your life coming up, not often.
yeah, it's been a while for me. I use it for customer service. I use it for
Hmm.
transactional booking an appointment. But at least what we've started noticing is that at least in Asia, when you book appointments now, if you want to make a reservation at a restaurant, you don't do it via email anymore. It's a lot of it's just like, hey, what's your phone number? What's Can you reach out to this site, and then we'll message you the confirmation. So slowly, what at least again a prediction,
Yeah.
not just e-commerce based, but a lot of the services, like if you want to book an appointment for a hair salon or a nail appointment, this will start to happen over messaging as well.
Makes sense that this could also work for ecom. I mean, already there's so much information that like you get over email right now where you can already start to see it for like texts like that, shipping and tracking information, something people care about a lot in terms of ecom. I can imagine there's use cases for things like that or promotion or all these things that like sit in your spam folder now. As seems like you're saying, if you're one of the first movers on like a channel like Messenger or something that's underutilized, you might have that real estate that is slightly more noticeable than in the bottom of someone's spam folder.
I think it's not just the real estate right now, because real estate
Hmm.
like that will go away in time, right?
Of
In the
course,
sense
yeah,
where when other
true.
people catch on, like, hey, this is a very effective channel, then competition will move in. The other
Hmm.
thing that we've been talking with our customers, marketers, it's just kind of the experience in terms of like, hey, you have a head start in terms of how to use this. Like the analogy we also use is, imagine you were one of the first people to do Facebook ads. How much better, like how much more experience you would have, and how much more knowledge you would have compared to the rest of the people that are starting up now.
Hmm. That's a great analogy, and I imagine like over time you see all these kind of playbooks that people make with like the best subject lines for like email and best SMS. I'm sure will if you don't have them already, I'm sure soon enough there'll be some for one send type messengers as well.
Yes, definitely.
That's definitely going to be interesting to see where that wraps up. Well, I love all of the nice insights that we've gotten in our conversation today. I hope that everyone who's listening in can maybe think about like auditing the channels that they're using and if it might make sense to try to test this into their marketing mix. But I can't let you go without our click-worthy tip segment. Of course, this is click to buy, and I always have to ask my guests for one quick conversion tip based on lessons that you've learned in your life and career. So, Michael, what's one key phrase or short piece of advice that you can give ecom store owners looking to improve their customer journey?
This is a great question. I think the one piece, and it's not just e-com merchants. It's I think anybody who's in business is don't lie to your customers. It's very easy to fall into this trap, and I'll give you the big example and the biggest like infraction I see is when people say like, "Hey, we're extending this sale." This happens a lot for Black Friday, maybe for Prime Day sales. Is we're like, "Hey, this is you have 30 12 hours left of the sale," and then right after your customer buys, they'll say like, "Oh, we're actually extending it for another 24 hours." This,
Hmm.
I think these type of tactics used to work, right? They used to be where you could get away with it, but now that customers have gotten a lot more sophisticated, and rightfully so, they'll catch on to this stuff. And once you break the trust with your customer, like then your whole retention playbook is out the door. You're not going to be able to build up that trust and loyalty that you've been wanting to.
Absolutely. And I think like then you also train your customers to like with your discount example, like if I know a brand's always going to like be playing around with these discounts, I'm never going to buy at full price. I'm just going to wait
Exactly.
around rather than like some brands that are really like honest and they're saying like this is our only sale this year. You
Yeah.
better like bet that I'm going to be at that sale because I trust and know this is the only time if I want that discount and probably I'll continue to buy throughout the year if I'm really passionate about that brand.
You've kind of I know we're at the last minute, but there's
Yeah,
one thing that's happened. It's
go
exactly
for
what
it.
you just mentioned. Is this
Uh-huh.
kind of concept of constant discounting? So there's a phenomenon here that it's called the double holidays. So pretty much
Hmm.
11/11, 12/12, 3/3, like all those dates have become their own mini Black Fridays within Asia. And now the
Hmm.
problem is that all the consumers, myself included, have become so trained to have this monthly sale that we will never like we rarely buy stuff outside of that because like okay, it's gonna go down. So
Hmm.
that's because that's how we like how a lot of these brands have reestablished like okay, we're not gonna buy the full price anymore.
Absolutely. Well, I love that. Also, the trend, I didn't know that that was happening in Asia quite like that with all those kind of number holidays as well. Super interesting. Nice little piece of another gem from the podcast for people listening in looking from trends from abroad. Well, Michael, it was so great to have you on the podcast. And of course, I know where to find you, but for anyone who's listening in who might want more of your advice or want to try out OneSend, where can we find you online?
Definitely. So we have a website, onesend.net. You can email me personally at m@onesend.net, or you can just DM me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Per- Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast again, Michael. I really appreciated all your advice on how ecom brands can use Messenger to scale their growth. That's a wrap for today's episode. Once again, I'm your host, Becca Anderson, coming at you from Instant Page Builder. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, let me know what topics you want me to talk about next with fellow ecom enthusiasts like Michael. And until next time, keep turning those clicks into buys.